The topic today, emissions trading and industrial transformation, deals with a particularly difficult sector, or a sector that has posed some challenges in decarbonization. Industry accounts for about 20 to 25% of global emissions. And there are a few features that make the sector particularly difficult to decarbonize. One is that many industries have process emissions or require large amounts of industrial heat. And so the processes to produce low or zero carbon industrial goods, especially basic materials such as steel or cement, can be very costly. Also, and perhaps even more importantly, at least politically, the goods that these industries produce are often globally traded commodities. So imposing a carbon cost raises the specter of leakage of production, investment, along with the associated jobs and emissions, of course. And that makes it both politically and economically as much as environmentally challenging. We have about 60 minutes today to discuss this topic, which I think is very timely. And we'll start with 30 to 35 minutes of introductory remarks and discussant remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Please note that the session is being recorded, and as mentioned in the chat, I encourage you to kindly mute your microphone unless you're later called upon to ask a question to the panelists. So let me introduce our stellar panel. We're going to start with Oliver Sartor, who's Senior Advisor for Industry at Agora Energiewende, and then follow with Damien Meadows, who's Advisor on European and International Carbon Markets at Director General Climate Action at the European Commission. And then we'll follow with shorter discussant remarks by Caroline Fischer, who's a professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, as well as Karen Perry, who's energy strategy responsible for energy strategy and policies at Covestro, a representative of industry does. So I think it's a really good and diverse panel to look at this complex issue. And I think that probably many of you here in the audience didn't actually need an introduction, since they're well known and have spoken and written about these issues many times in the past. So I'll hand over to Oliver, who will share some slides with us, and again, about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll shift over to Damien, and then we'll have the discussants. And after that, I'll say a few words about how the discussion will go with the audience, the Q&A. Oliver, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen, my presentation?
Yes, we see them. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so yes, I was asked to say a few words about carbon pricing and its role in decarbonizing heavy industry. So let's jump into it. So sorry, first I'm just moving Michael's picture so I can see my own slides. So I mean, I think there are some important things to say about, I think, the role of emissions trading in supporting decarbonization in general, and also for industry. But maybe just some general comments first. I think if we look, and I would come at this, by the way, from a perspective from the European Union, where I've worked most of my career. But I think this is probably generally true. So one is, a key advantage of emissions trading is that it just very simply places a binding, declining constraint on actors in the economy to decarbonize, right? So emissions have to reduce. And this is just a very helpful, not only because of the incentives it creates through the carbon price, but also, I think, as a sort of a focusing instrument to focus minds on the task at hand and to coordinate policy around that objective. So I think that's one area where it can be very helpful, and that's also true for industry. A second strength, I think, of emissions trading is the fact that it can raise very significant revenues by pricing a public bad, in inverted commas, to fund innovation and support climate action. And this is, I think, really, in some ways, one of the biggest contributions of emissions trading. In addition, obviously, there is evidence, I think, from the European experience that emissions trading and carbon pricing does drive certain kinds of abatement. I think so far in the EU, we've not seen very high carbon prices, so it's difficult to draw universal conclusions about all of the different abatement options in the cost curve. But I think what we've seen so far is that with the carbon prices we've had, the low-hanging fruit, such as fuel switching, has been something that the carbon market has driven quite efficiently when the carbon price has had scarcity of allowances in the market. So there's plenty of evidence of this in the literature that I can go into if you like. And then finally, I think what we do see also in the EU is the carbon market helps to influence company innovation and investment strategies. I think I'll talk a bit more in a minute about some of the challenges also around some of those investments, but but we certainly see that the carbon price is a motor for change. And to give you an example of this, so if we talk about industry now specifically, in the EU we have steel, cement, and basic chemical production covered under the EU emissions trading scheme. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is carbon prices have bounced back after the economic crisis, and in the wake of some reforms also to correct an oversupply of allowances, is a whole bunch of pilot projects for kind of breakthrough technologies for, deep decarbonized production processes for steel, cement, and chemicals. Now, these projects are not yet commercial scale; they're pilot scale. So we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions yet about what's actually going on. But nonetheless, we see that the constraint of the carbon price, the reducing cap over time, is driving industry to invest in this kind of innovation. At the same time, though, I think we also have to be realistic about what carbon pricing can and can't do. The challenge of decarbonisation or getting to climate neutrality is a huge one, and we have to be realistic about the fact that requires a bunch of different. It requires tackling a bunch of different obstacles to the transition, and that pricing can help us with some of these, perhaps not be sufficient to tackle all of them. So actually, there's a great book on this written by Michael Grubb, Carsten Neuhoff, and Jean-Charles Orcard, called Planetary Economics, which came out about 5 years ago, and they have this lovely breakdown, I think, of, if you think about the different obstacles to the transition, you can kind of, with only a little bit of too much simplicity, categorize them into three groups. You have behavioral challenges. So the fact that people don't always behave in an economically rational way, right? Because there might be split incentives. So for example, in buildings, you have landlords that don't care about the energy cost of the tenant, for example. You have so-called satisficing behavior, where people are a little bit inefficient the way they consume energy or products. They could actually optimize a bit better, but they don't, because near enough is kind of good enough. And they have obviously limited or bounded rationality, right? And so for these kinds of things, you can think about relevant policy tools as being, things that overcome those behavioral kind of problems. So regulations, norms, standards, things like this. Then we have a second domain, I think, of obstacles, which is about relative costs, right? And this is, I think, where carbon pricing and other fiscal policies really come into their own. So this is where, economic actors, big companies, energy companies, will optimize their decisions, to a significant degree about which fuels to use in their production processes, markets will decide whether to use gas or coal or other energy sources depending on prices and return on investment, right? So this is where I think carbon pricing and fiscal policies, in some cases also I think feed-in tariffs for renewables can be very effective. And then there's a third domain where we're actually talking about something a little bit more complex, which is sort of systemic change. And I think this is an area where I think we've only recently come to terms with the fact that the transition is more complicated than maybe we initially anticipated, maybe 15 years ago. And we have to also put in place a bunch of enabling conditions to drive this deeper, more structural kind of systemic change. So if we think about fostering breakthrough technologies, that's true for industry, for example, the kind of technologies I was talking about, or integrating them into markets. So, integration of renewable electricity into energy or into electricity markets, for example, developing key infrastructure, which requires, more than just markets. It requires regulation, planning, financing, so on. And also just the social aspects, right? So there's the whole just transition aspect of this, which we can't forget. So I think, when you look at this, you then realize, look, we need a broad picture, but carbon pricing is one key pillar in that, right? And all that to say, and often what's important, I think, for policy is bringing these elements together, into to crystallize in an effective solution. So, for example, if we talk about coal phase out, right, in Europe, one of the big decisions recently was Germany effectively agreeing amongst stakeholders to phase out the use of coal-fired power by 2038 at the latest. And this involved, tackling all of those issues that I was talking about. So the energy system operators, the workers, the companies, the mining regions, bringing them together to identify common solutions and find compromise. But at the same time, I also think that this was accelerated, this process, because of the carbon pricing and the ETS in the background. And it can also, I think, still be accelerated by the carbon pricing future as well. So I think, it's not really an either or. I think it's a question of the policy package that comes together. Now, if we talk about industry in particular, So if we talk about energy-intensive industries, which I think are one of the main sources of emissions industries, so steel, cement, and basic chemicals account for about 65–70% of industrial emissions in the EU. Then we're talking, once again, I think about unlocking a range of sort of levers of decarbonisation. So you can see from these scenarios here, which were developed by Material Economics, that we're going to need new processes, so new low carbon ways of making steel and cement and so on. We'll probably need a little bit of carbon capture and storage. We'll also need, though, a much more circular economy. We'll need a little bit more materials efficiency and sort of circular business models, and maybe some also ways to tackle remaining emissions. And so what you see again is a picture of elements that have to come together. And carbon pricing, I think, can help with a bunch of those, but we'll also need to overlay some other policies. So to give you an example, if we talk about the economics of sort of climate neutral sort of process technologies, okay, so this is one of the key solutions. We can list here in a bunch of different breakthrough technologies, quote unquote, that we think we'll need to deploy in the next, probably begin deploying in the next 10 years, actually, to have a chance of meeting the climate neutrality goal by 2050 in the EU, at any rate. The cost of these technologies is actually still very high, right? So the abatement costs here, which is plotted on the horizontal axis, are well above not just current carbon prices, which is the dotted red line or pink line that you see in the graph, but also probably above the 30 to 60 euros a ton range that we would expect carbon prices to perhaps go if the EU increases its climate ambition to 2030. So what we need to do then is work with this carbon pricing to kind of complement it to help these technologies actually be in the money that they can invest in. So one of the policy proposals that a number of the Agora Energy vendor, but also some other think tanks in Europe have been proposing, has been this idea of carbon contracts for difference to support projects, right? So the idea is actually relatively simple. It's just if we assume that a given project will require an abatement cost or a carbon price of, say, 100 euros a ton in order to be economically viable for investment, well, then the government can effectively step in to propose to complement the carbon price at the end of any given year to make up the difference between the required carbon price for that project and the actual realized carbon price. And so this would be a way of basically supporting some of these strategic climate neutral technology projects, which we think are fundamental to industry decarbonisation. At the same time, it also builds on the existing carbon market structure, right? So we're not undermining it, we're just trying to complement it in a way that we can actually drive the necessary investments more quickly than would otherwise be the case because we have a limited window of time. This can also, I think, be complementary to other funding policies as well. More generally, I think also if we actually look at industry transformation, I think we're going to discover that there are a bunch of things, not just in terms of technology change, like I was talking about, but also along the value chain, which we'll need to find a way to tackle, right? So you have the upstream part of the value chain where we're talking about you have to have access to key infrastructure, so sufficient affordable clean energy, especially if we're talking about things like new energy sources like hydrogen. So that will require new key infrastructure to be developed, similarly for CCS or even just clean power. Plus, we need to think also about, well, there's an integration that needs to occur in some of the industrial clusters as well to optimize the use of that infrastructure. So we need to plan that and think it through and develop sometimes, I think, the necessary regulatory frameworks, because sometimes we'll have monopolies actually providing certain infrastructure. In the midstream part of the value chain, then is like the production processes. That's kind of what I was talking about before. And so here it's about, I think, if you actually look at what it takes to invest in these things, the carbon price, I think, is a key component. But then it's also building on that to cover this additional operating costs, and potentially also some sort of financial instruments that can help provide risk mitigation for the capital investments for unproven technologies, because that can also be, I think, a barrier to some investments. And of course, as Michael mentioned earlier, we're going to, with higher carbon prices, we will need protection from carbon leakage, because the risks, I think, if we have much higher carbon prices in the past, is that we would have an unlevel playing field, and that could create some problems for the viability of these projects. And then finally, and I'll finish up in a minute, so I don't take too long, but if we have the downstream part of the value chain, then we're talking about the products themselves, right? So this is where, a few things need to happen. One thing is that I think ultimately we have to find a way for the the cost of this innovation to be reflected in the final product, the cost of decarbonisation to be embedded in the final product the consumer faces, so that it's internalized into the market. I think we will also need to find ways to stimulate demand for climate neutral basic materials, to create lead markets that hopefully we can scale over time. And so to do this, we probably also need to be a little bit clear about what do we actually mean by a climate neutral basic material. So what's climate neutral steel, etc. And so that may require some degree of standardization. And then we also need to think about circular economy and material efficiency, which I think are, as shown, I think in the graphs before, are really important parts of this picture to actually have a hope of managing the infrastructure constraints to get to net zero. And as you can see with the red marks here, some of these are related to carbon pricing, but there's also a number which will require, I think, additional complementary policies. This is my last slide. So at Agora, we've developed sort of what we like to call a clean industry package for the EU. It's a very fancy title, but the idea is basically just trying to map out, how you might respond to these constraints with some different kinds of policies. I won't go into this in detail because I don't want to take too long, but we can perhaps discuss this in the discussion afterwards. And I think that's all, Michael. I might hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Oliver. That was a remarkable amount of information, and you kept to the time pretty much. So I really appreciate that. And I think it sets the scene wonderfully for the rest of the session. Damien, I'll hand over to you. And I know you'll pick up on many of the themes that Oliver already discussed. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. Can you hear me, just to check?
Absolutely. We can hear and see you.
Great. Well, I mean, thanks a lot, Oliver. That was a very good presentation. And speaking from the Commission perspective, I would agree with the large majority of what you said there. So I didn't think I needed to bring my own slides to this event today. The key thing, I mean, you need a price signal. This is essential for addressing climate change. And I mean, the ETS, one of its main virtues is it exists. It is, of course, imperfect. But we've seen the challenges that there have been in the United States, in Australia, in other jurisdictions. And so the issue is you need to price carbon, you need to improve it. You also need other measures in parallel. I mean, I'm glad that the recent Commission communications have been affirming this, because once there was the idea that you just price carbon and do nothing else and we'll solve climate change in the timescale in which we need to solve it. Thankfully, that's no longer the orthodoxy. I mean, if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change, you need a carbon price and you need other measures. And of course, it would be ideal to have a global carbon price. And I ideally would love to live in this world, many of us would, that had a global carbon price. But if we've learned anything in the 23 years since Kyoto, it's that it's damn difficult to do. There are issues of per capita levels of emissions. There are big challenges. I mean, Europe's helped bring the Doha Amendment to Kyoto into force. But I mean, it's not going to do very much that we haven't already got in law, as it will enter into force on the 31st of December this year. So the work Europe's been doing with China, with Korea, with New Zealand, we can build up action over time, but it's essentially bottom up here. One thing I wanted to highlight in the time we have is the Inception Impact Assessment that the Commission published about 2 weeks ago for revising the ETS. And I hope that Oliver and others have seen that there's an explicit mention of contracts for difference funded through the ETS Innovation Fund. We've just had the first call for proposals close for the ETS funded Innovation Fund. And it's as oversubscribed as Harvard, I'm amazed to see. There's €1 billion available and industry is asking for over 20 billion. So that there'll be selection there. I mean, what can I say? I wish everyone was able to get the funding they need here, because we do need this level of greater action. And I think the way the Innovation Fund is being run is a big improvement from what we had through the terribly named NER 300. And I saw very interestingly, there's a project for green hydrogen at a German refinery, the Lingen refinery, from BP and Ørsted, which looks very interesting in terms of capital expenditure support to build up things like green hydrogen. But coming back to contracts for difference, I think I first saw these about a decade ago in Waxman-Markey. And I mean, we've always been keen to learn from the US experience, because we'd be very keen that the US have a similar magnitude of climate policies in place. And we are divided by a common language and things like this. So the more similar Europe has, I think, is always helpful. And so this idea of bridging the operational expenditure, we've seen there, and we'll soon be starting the open public consultation for revision of ETS, which may or may not say more on this issue. But I think that being able to fund clean hydrogen, clean ammonia, clean steel, all these sorts of things, it's probably among today's audience, we do understand that the carbon price alone is unlikely to bridge the gap at present. We need to go further, and I think contracts for difference can be very helpful in doing that. Now, I mentioned synthetic fuels, and I think we know that these will be needed in the future. And I guess I would urge people to draw the lines between our main discussion today and issues like shipping coming into the ETS. If we want ships to use synthetic ammonia, then how, for example, could we use the legislative process to ensure they get support for this? I mean, we've had significant revenues from the ETS up till now. I think over 60 billion euros auction revenue from member states in the last 6 or 7 years. When shipping comes into the ETS, I imagine there would be additional revenues. And could these revenues go back to the sector? Could they ensure that we actually do get short distance battery powered ships like the Danish ferry that exists, but also ammonia powered ships for longer journeys or hydrogen? The same for aviation. I mean, we hear these ambitions from aviation to use synthetic fuels. The sad reality is that 1/20th of 1%, 0.05% of the fuel used by aviation is even biofuels. It's not even synthetic. And to sort of quote Bill Clinton here, it's the economics. Unless you get the economics right here, then frankly, it's greenwashing. And if we're moving to full auctioning for aviation over time, as the President of the Commission has indicated, I think some MEPs have been even clearer on the speed of this transition that should happen. We're talking about 700 million euros a year that could be used to fund contracts for difference or synthetic fuels. And at this point, I think we're finally starting to get serious. We have to make sure there's a level playing field, something that Oliver mentioned. I mean, for shipping and for aviation, this level playing field is absolutely clear that you can't treat certain companies more favorably than others. It has to be a level playing field in the European market. The last couple of elements I wanted to mention, I guess, were, well, I mean, we do have conditionality coming into the ETS now for the indirect emissions state aid. From the 2020s, it's conditional on companies looking into and investing in improved and more efficient processes. And I think that's an interesting step in terms of trying to use trying to use state support in a more productive manner. You can also look at this for free allocations, because to give another example, ammonia produced from fossil fuels receives a free allocation today in the ETS. Hydrogen produced from fossil fuels receives a free allocation in the ETS, I think in the order of 9 allowances per ton of hydrogen. Now, if you were to be producing hydrogen from renewables, I think there's a company who've said we could opt these into the ETS, we could make sure we get equal treatment. It would be important to make sure they get equal treatment, or you'd have a climate policy discouraging green hydrogen, which would seem to be a shame. We didn't talk, in the discussion we may talk about carbon capture and utilization, sort of net removals from the atmosphere. Here I would just mention the ETS has an article, I think Michael probably knows it, Article 24A of the directive, which can cover domestic projects of whatever type, including domestic projects that have a net benefit, the net removals. Now, this hasn't been recognized because it hasn't happened, but the ETS is ready for these things, and to the extent it isn't, then we have a review process kicking off with legislation June next year. So I would urge everyone to come forward into those consultations and bring up ideas, because this is a vital 6 or 7 months right now. last point, I guess, I mean, I agree with almost all of what Oliver said, and I agree, this behavioral change, this systems change, lead markets, I mean, we need all of these in parallel, and so hopefully they do happen in parallel in combination with improvements to European carbon pricing. So thank you very much, and I pass back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Damien. And I cannot echo enough what you said right at the beginning, that the orthodoxy is slowly changing. I work at MIT. I still have some of the holdouts of the old vision that, you know, one carbon price, first best, nothing else. But it is changing, and that's really encouraging. And what you described underscores that. It's not just changing in theory, but also really being operationalized. And with this, I'd invite our discussants, again, I think well-known figures in this space. Let's start with Carolyn Fisher, who has written and spoken about these issues a lot. And she may chide me for having referred to the economist orthodoxy, being a non-economist myself. Carolyn, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Michael. Well, I've actually been talking about, you know, complementary policies for a long time, and one can reconcile them with the orthodoxy by considering that we have multiple market failures here. And I thought Oliver did a great job in his presentation of laying out the additional barriers beyond the carbon price. So what I see is, like, maybe I'll just highlight sort of two main issues here. So we have a short run issue, which is that the you know, our politically feasible carbon price does not give enough incentive to really undertake the kinds of, you know, big lumpy investments in high cost, ultra low carbon technologies. So if we want to bring forth these technologies, we do need supplementary policies. Contract for differences, green procurement, etc. One thing I think we need to point out, though, is that, you know, if we're incentivizing these investments in industries that are already under the cap, we're not actually getting additional emissions reductions by getting them to switch to ultra low carbon processes. So the contract for differences, you're essentially kind of rewarding averted emissions, but these are still under the cap. So it you know, makes it easier for the cap to be met in a sense. So we need to think, you know, while we're in this state, we need to think of these as technology policies. So these are our complementary policies. So we want to think about, you know, where are the real opportunities for innovation? You know, what kind of partnerships do we need to demonstrate these technologies and bring the cost down, and also bring them down and make these you know, the advanced tech that the rest of the world that maybe doesn't have carbon pricing also may want to pick up. In the long run, you know, the EU is aiming for net zero. And so this becomes, I think this is really the big challenge for industry, because you know, if your cap is essentially going to zero, then you don't really have allowances, many allowances left to allocate freely to deal with competitiveness issues. And so you basically have two options there. So one is for carbon adjustments, which I'm happy to talk more about, and which is sort of a path that the EU's exploring now with the Green Deal. And the other is, if you want to keep using free allocation, then you have to come up with ways to incentivize carbon removal credits. And so then, and there's a question of, you know, what is the most cost-effective way of doing that. So I think that that aspect hasn't gotten as much attention for how in the EU ETS, how to reconcile the ETS, which is a cap, with bringing in negative emissions. So maybe I'll leave that for thought and pass it on.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. And of course, you're absolutely right. There's a market failure for every challenge. So I'll hand over to Karen. Karen, you work with Covestro, which produces various materials, various plastics. So you have a unique perspective. You're the only one on this panel that is actually in industry. Can you share some thoughts from your side, how the decarbonization of industry challenge can be best met and what the role of ETS is?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm happy to be with you and to hear all your insights, because my impression is that there is a lot of understanding of industry. And yes, of course, from our point of view, there are huge challenges with regard even to the goal to become zero until 2050. And if you look at chemical industry especially, so where do the emissions come from? And the major share of the emissions come from energy consumption, indeed. So for our processes, we need a lot of steam and a lot of electricity. And of course, we could decarbonize the electricity and we could decarbonize the steam, but that would cost us a lot of electricity. So for example, for the steam, we could use electrode boilers. We can produce pressure up to 30 bar pressure. Steam, that's quite fine, we can work with it. But of course, the costs are 3 times higher than if we use gas, for example. Maybe carbon contracts for difference could help us when installing those boilers, even with regard to operating costs, but how long would we like to support those things? That's a question for me, for example. It wouldn't be sufficient to do it for 5 years or 10. Maybe until we have a global international playing field in terms of CO2 costs and in terms of installed techniques. Then we have, of course, some processes that are emitting CO2 as part of the chemical reaction. For example, we have some processes where laughing gas is emitted. I think with regard to Europe, those emissions, from my knowledge, are widely tackled. So we have laughing gas absorptions in most of our European plants. And yes, another big share is hydrogen production from reformers. If you operate the reformer to the hydrogen, you can operate it to CO and hydrogen production in combination, then you have not that much CO2 emissions. And there could be the hydrogen economy a solution, provide a solution. But again, we need a huge amount of electricity. And for Germany, for example, we know that we won't be able to cover all the needed electricity by our own resources stemming from wind and solar and biomass and so on. And even if we look at recycling, we have to check our recycling processes that we have to develop, because for me, it's not for sure that they will go hand in hand with an emission reduction, because depending on the process, we have to bring in additional energy to create the high energy molecules that are our products, and our raw materials stemming from fossil-based oil. They bring a lot of energy content with it. So, and chemistry need carbon for their product, and will need carbon. For me, that's for sure, I think. And then I will come to another point, and that's, for me, missing in all our strategies we have at European level, especially. So that's the carbon usage. Yes, of course, we have to improve our waste management, especially with regard to chemical industry. We have to develop more recycling technologies and use all the carbon we can get. But there are products like cosmetics, medicines, coatings, adhesives. There is carbon in it, and it's hard to use as carbon again. And so we need additional CO2 sources. And I think we have to think over our system. What kind of carbon will we use in future times? And how do we deal with the resources we have, with biomass, with, I name it, waste, with solar, with wind? Because from my point of view, from my thinking, all those resources are limited. Okay, and now let's discuss maybe.
Indeed, Karen, and thank you very much for yet further food for thought, and also some remarks about the hard realities of implementing many of these concepts in practice. So I think our panel really gave us an excellent starting point, and I also want to commend all of you for having stayed within time. That leaves us with about 20 minutes, a bit over 20 minutes for discussion. And I would much prefer, if anybody has questions, if you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself, and ideally even show yourself if you have a video available at your end. Introduce yourself and then ask your question. But chat is also an option if you prefer much. And I see already, I'll start with that. I see a question popping up in the chat from Daria Nochevnik, and it's to Damien. Damien, could you share your views regarding the establishment of a regulatory framework for certification of carbon removals?
Just starting. Thanks, Daria. I've switched off the video, I think, and I think. Thanks, Daria. Yeah, as I said in my comments, I guess, I mean, we've had this ability in the ETS to recognize carbon removals since 2008. And I guess I'm waiting until it actually starts happening at scale, because it's always been clear that the ETS can and should reward removals. We also have work in the Commission going on a more generalized system of certification for removals. I think some of the key questions there are how to avoid double counting. So if you say you have a refinery that's producing road fuel, and so the CO2 comes out of the cars, how do you ensure that your math still adds up? I mean, the ETS has had to be kind of purer than pure as long as we have people in the US, UK, elsewhere trying to criticize climate action, trying to deny. Then if you have some loopholes in your accounting, then I think you're in big trouble. So these should be addressed. But if people start doing removals tomorrow, then I'm confident, you know, those removals can be rewarded. It's just we need to make sure the accounting matches. And you know, external input is very welcome here because it's a common issue around the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Damien, I wanted to, you mentioned Article 24A of the EU ETS directive, and it outlines a process where the Commission would adopt some sort of delegated rules in order to operationalize this process. What exactly would that entail, and how long could that take? Has there been any discussion or preparation on that front already? So if you can shed some more light on just the process and what the Commission needs in order to get started on that, I think it'd be very interesting for the audience.
I mean, historically, DG Klima has been very, very short-staffed. So we've been operating the ETS, we've been doing car standards, other things, but we haven't kind of had people around twiddling their fingers. 24A was designed to be bottom-up. I mean, at the time, France, Italy, and others were thinking of having domestic projects. And the line was, yeah, you're welcome to, but let's make sure that you don't have France objecting to what Italy does. I mean, that we have a kind of common approach to this. So I think the member states could come forward with this. I mean, these are very detailed issues. I mean, and I can see Karen's level of chemical knowledge goes well beyond what I knew when I stopped studying chemistry at 18. And we need kind of experts to come in with all these issues. It's not enough. The Commission has plenty of lawyers who can write rules and economists who can advise what's economically efficient. But there's a lot of practical experience, I think, here, which would need to be engineering experience, which would need to look at the flows of the things. If you're producing fertilizer, urea, then you have emissions back into the atmosphere, these kinds of things. So it's there, and it's essentially waiting to be activated. And in parallel, we have the statements in the circular economy communications in the 2030 target plan about establishing a broader regulatory framework looking at removals. And then we also have, you know, we've had ECJ cases like Schaefer Calc about precipitated calcium carbonate. So things like this exist the whole time. And I think as we get more serious about addressing climate change, as we explore these things, we will find answers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Damien. Just another clarification on how the audience can participate in discussion. So the raise hand function should be visible to you, but if it's not, or if you, different layouts, different computers, operating system, etc., sometimes it looks different. You can also just type in the chat that you want to have the floor, and I'll make sure that you're acknowledged and can speak. And again, if you want to type your question, if you prefer that, that's fine as well. So this is, I think, a very, very important topic that Damien just spoke about, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in coming years as industry faces the challenge of decarbonizing and may have opportunities to reduce outside of their scope 1 emissions. Let's see. One topic, as long as there's no other questions coming, that I'm happy in a way that we didn't immediately speak about is, of course, border carbon adjustments. I imagine that might be something that more people will ask about, but because it's being discussed in so many other fora and it's such a hot topic, which I think is good that we didn't immediately zero in on that. I'm just still wondering if Oliver, Damien, or Karen or Carolyn, if you have any thoughts on that there still is a residual role for that alongside other complementary instruments, or whether indeed, the key really lies on things such as combining the carbon price with contracts, carbon contracts for difference, etc. And I do see Anne has raised her hand, so she'll be given the floor right after this round of answers. Any volunteers from the panel?
Maybe I'll take a
start. Oh, sorry.
Let's Carolyn and then Karen. It's great that both of you
Okay.
want to. Thanks. Wonderful.
I was just going to say that I think it's it's interesting to to think about border carbon adjustments in conjunction with these industries where we're really trying to bring forth ultra low carbon technologies, and using that, I think, as part of the pitch for why they're necessary, and as a way, and sort of demonstrating to our trade partners that there aren't a lot of good ways, absent just subsidies, which are also can be controversial, to incentivize these technologies. And also bringing those as a way potentially to incentivize, to reward producers in other countries that are adopting these clean technologies, to give greater market access. So I think this frame of really addressing the challenges of deep decarbonization and technologies that we need in combination with sort of bringing forth BCAs could, I think help acceptability as well as, being justified.
Thanks, Carolyn. And Karen.
So I think if you regard it as an ideal system where you are able to get the exact carbon content in each product, it could be ideal. So if you would be capable to know all the carbon impact of each product that comes into the EU and goes out of the EU, it would be a perfect system from my point of view. The problem is the lack of information. So carbon content of the products is depending on many influences of your degree of operability of the plants, of the kind of the plant. If you look at the chemical industry, you have a lot of co-products. You have a chemical system. It's like an organism where you have raw material that flow into your first production, and the bundle of products or intermediates come out of your first production, and that goes into other production. And they are all interlinked in terms of energy and in terms of raw material flows. And to figure out an exact carbon footprint depending on the operational level of all the plants and the interdependencies, it's very hard to do so. And you have to look at the value chain as well. So you could do it for steel, for example, but then an importer can ask themselves the question, why not importing the steel-made product if I have a tax on the steel? And all those answers have to be found if you want to install such a carbon, such a border system, so to say. And that's really, really hard to do from my point of view in a practical and operable way, so that we can handle it within industry. Maybe for industries that are not that complex like chemical industry, it could be easier, but for chemical industry, for me, it's very hard to imagine.
Thanks, Karen. And just a shout out that there is a session tomorrow in this pavilion, in the ICAP AITA Carbon Markets Virtual Pavilion, which is dedicated to looking at those thorny issues. I think it's tomorrow, early afternoon. Anne de Kugelaere, you've raised your hand, please, indicating you'd like to ask a question. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Anne. I'm in the cement industry, and I would like to have ask a question to Oliver. We know that energy-intensive industry will decrease the CO2, but there will be always some level of CO2 that they won't be able to decrease. So which means that we will have to opt for carbon capture, storage, and utilization. But knowing the volume that there will be to store or to utilize, how will that be in Europe? Because in Europe, all the cement plants are very far from any oil well or potential CO2 storage. There might be others in the country, but very little. So does that mean that we'll have to build huge pipelines? Will one plant be more will be better positioned compared to another one? For example, the Norwegian cement plants will be much better, which means that we could produce more cement there and bring it to Europe. Should we close some plants that are too far from any CO2 storage facility? So yes.
Thanks, Anne. Anybody in the Oliver? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, so thanks for asking me the most difficult question possible, Anne. So I think, first of all, what I would say is, I think you come at this from a cement perspective, right? So I think yeah. For something like steel or chemicals, it's not as obvious to me that it's so difficult to get emissions down without carbon capture and storage. I think the question is for cement, where we don't yet see large alternative materials, basically, and we'll still probably need some clinker going forward. Yes. About that, I would say, look, I'm a bit nervous about starting a conversation about decarbonisation, even of an industry like cement, talking only about CCU and CCS. My personal view is it will be necessary, but the concern is that I think there's actually a lot of other abatement levers we could also pull, right? Whether it's circular cement technologies, improving the design of the final product to use less cement per unit of concrete, less concrete per unit of building, longer building life, etc. I think the question is, how far can you push all of those other things, but you can then reduce this residual emissions down to a level where you can actually have some kind of balance between the actual sinks and the demand for carbon? Because I agree, I think CCU is a false solution often it's offered as, because people just assume there'll be these massive markets for CO2, and they don't exist. I mean, you've got to find them somewhere. Like somebody was telling me, oh, we could put all of the CO2 from this cement plant into the local beer production. It's like, no, no one is going to drink that much beer, right? So it's true. You know what I mean? So I think it's about starting the conversation the right way, which is not to say we shouldn't develop some CCS in places where it really obviously makes sense, right? Like around Norway and the North Sea and things like this. But I would be inclined to push a broader portfolio of technologies as well.
Great, thank you, Oliver, and thanks, Anne, for the good question. I noticed in the chat, I have a question by Renato. He's looping back to the fact that speakers mentioned the importance of looking at the whole value chain and full production process, production cycles. And so the question is how the EU ETS in its fourth phase beginning in 2021 can align and strengthen the new circular economy strategy and the new industrial strategy for Europe, or asked vice versa, do these strategies help strengthen and enhance the ETS? Any thoughts on that question from the panelists?
I would try to give an answer.
Thank you, Karen.
Yes, would be happy if I will be corrected or whatever. So from my understanding, EU ETS sticks to the single installation, to single plants. That means if you have a specific plant that recycles material, whatever material, if it's energy intense and goes hand in hand with a huge CO2 emission, then it will become part of the EU ETS. And then the EU ETS looks at the emission that comes out of this installation. So it doesn't matter if it's a recycling production facility or not. It looks only at the emission. If you, for example, melt polymers and use them again, or melt steel or whatever metal, then I think you don't need that, or maybe you don't have that much emissions, and then the installation won't be part of the EU ETS. So from my understanding, because recycling addresses mainly Scope 3 emissions, it's hard to become part of the EU ETS or to give incentives or to give some relief for installations that are under EU ETS, despite only if you can save raw materials and if you don't use your plants that are in or part of EU ETS in the same way, because you have alternative processes due to recycling. Then I think it can contribute.
Thanks, Karen. You point out, and one of these interesting things about emissions. So the Scope 3 emissions of an EU ETS installation are the Scope 1 emissions of a waste management facility or a recycling facility, of course. I wonder if Damien has any thoughts on whether indeed, again, thinking about maybe Article 24A as a process to allow EU ETS installations to have some form of recognition for reductions outside, or does that get too complicated? Do we risk double counting, and are the boundaries too fuzzy?
I mean, these are questions that will come up because there has been this mantra, keep the ETS as simple as possible. We failed to keep it as simple as possible on contact with reality. So it's possible to descend into, I guess, ever increasing levels of complexity. On the other hand, we have to get the right incentive structures. And I think what we're talking about, issues such as waste management, waste incineration, I'm not sure all of us, speaking personally, will enjoy looking at these issues, but we need to look at these issues to ensure we get them right. And I mean, the ETS incentivizes what it doesn't cover in terms of, say, wind farms, in terms of solar. So you've got these issues of thresholds. You've also got issues of free allocation. I mean, if you're using mostly biomass, you're in the ETS. If you're using exclusively biomass, you're not in the ETS. And yeah, there's examination going on these things to check we don't get perverse incentives. I mean, we've had this issue as well with companies, producing their own electricity compared to buying it from the grid. It would be a shame if carbon pricing just encouraged companies to buy their own boilers rather than importing and things like this. So I guess, I mean, much as I was happy to hear Michael saying the orthodoxy is moving away from the ETS being the sole instrument, the ETS can't solve all these problems, I guess. But I mean, at least in terms of what it does do, it can try to do it with the right incentive structure.
Great, it's fantastic. I fully concur with that. We're nearing the end of the session. If there was still one quick question, I think we could accommodate it, but we also have to be respectful of the fact that we're part of a day-long program with the next sessions starting very shortly. So I don't see any sort of urgent last questions. With that, then I would really want to thank our panelists for sharing their deep knowledge on this difficult, timely, important issue. To the audience for participating, of course, and for asking good questions. To the European Commission for helping support the webinar series, of which this is the first installment, as I mentioned at the outset, and to ICAP, of course, for hosting. And speaking of next installment, so there will be announcements through the usual channels. Everybody who's registered will also, of course, be informed of this. We're looking forward to having the next webinar in this series of ETS for practitioners on December 3rd, and it'll be on the role of emissions trading in the green recovery, which I think, again, is a very timely and important issue. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and have a good day and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.